Well, thank you so very much for that warm and generous introduction. Good evening to each of you. It's wonderful to be here on the Mercer campus for the first time to enjoy the cherry blossoms, the warm hospitality, and all of you fabulous students who no doubt are conscripted to be sitting here rather than playing outside in the beautiful sunshine. But I'm deeply grateful for the privilege to be in conversation with you this evening. I want to say a special word of thanks to Professor Thomas and Professor Jordan for their kindness in inviting a mere lawyer from the competition up the road to come to address this distinguished group. I want to thank the President for not vetoing that selection, nor the Elliots for their forbearance in not vetoing the selection. And I do want to say a very special word of admiration and appreciation to Tom and Ramona McDonald and their daughter Robin, who was with us. Tom and Ramona I've gotten to know over the last few years through their big brother Al, in whose chair I happen to sit at Embry. And Tom and Ramona have long been champions of issues of religion, of morality, of virtue in Western history and especially in American history, with deep devotion to the founding period, to the ideas that informed the 17th, 18th, and 19th century formation and initial explosion of America, and deeply reverent about the wisdom of the founding era, about the principles that they laid down in cultural and constitutional text, and their desire to maintain continued conversation about those fundamentals. They had been generous in a number of different ways to a lot of people around the country, and I'm particularly grateful that they directed their benefaction here and allowed this campus to become a host for the deep deliberative conversations around great texts that the founding era material deserves. As I was reflecting on my remarks for this evening while sitting on I-75, I drew some inspiration from a story that Justice William O. Douglas of the U.S. Supreme Court used to tell about his father. Justice Douglas's father was an itinerant pastor, and he served part-time in a number of churches that were too small to afford their own full-time pastors. And one Sunday morning, the Reverend Douglas appeared in a small church to lead the service and deliver the sermon, and he discovered on his arrival there was but one solitary soul in the entire sanctuary, and this was a cowboy visiting from the West. And so before proceeding, the Reverend Douglas came down off his pulpit and approached this solitary soul in the sanctuary and asked him if he really wanted to have the entire liturgy read and the full sermon delivered. And the young man was very uncomfortable, and he frowned and he fidgeted and he scratched his chin, and he finally said, "Well, I'm just a cowhand from Montana, and I don't know much. But I do know that if I went out in the middle of winter to feed the herd, and I found only one cow left, I would sure not leave her to starve." Well, thus encouraged, the Reverend Douglas bounded up onto the pulpit. He read through the entire liturgy. He delivered his full sermon, fire and brimstone and all. And after finally completing his efforts, he came down off the pulpit and approached this solitary soul in the sanctuary and said, "Oh, what'd you think?" Now, the young man was again very uncomfortable, and he frowned and he fidgeted and he scratched his chin a little and finally said, "Well, I'm just a cowhand from Montana, and I don't know much, but I do know that if I went out in the middle of winter to feed the herd, and I found only one cow left, I sure would not dump my entire load of feed on just that one cow." Well, this evening I propose to dump the entire load on you, taking a wide swath of material for 3 millennia, from early biblical texts all the way through to the latest machinations by the United States Supreme Court, as a prelude to the conversation that we want to have together during the Q&A 44 minutes from now. As you heard from Professor Thomas, the pretentious title of my lecture is Separation of Church and State in American History, Facts, Fictions, and Future Challenges. And this lecture is something of a response to a whole cottage industry of important new books and articles and briefs and judicial opinions that has emerged over the past couple of decades, devoted to a new history of separation of church and state. We now know, on account of this new history writing, a great deal more than we did a couple of decades ago about the history of separationist rhetoric, from Thomas Jefferson's famous 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association to Justice Hugo Black's famous 1947 Everson v. Board of Education opinion for the United States Supreme Court. We now know a good deal more about the odious manipulation of separationist rhetoric by the Ku Klux Klan and other nativist groups against Catholics and Jews and other minority faiths and immigrants in the later 19th and 20th centuries. And we now can see much more clearly than before that Justice Black drew some of his inspiration from these anti-religious nativist teachings in crafting his famous Everson opinion for the court. For peculiar souls like me who labor on the history of law, religion, and the First Amendment, this has all been a sobering but edifying corrective and enhancement to the traditional story. But the newly corrected history of religious liberty is quickly beginning to create its own ample distortions of the historical record. The first distortion, I submit, is the repeated argument by pundits and politicians and judicial authorities as well, that the principle of separation of church and state was an invention of 19th century anti-clerical and anti-religious elites, starting with Thomas Jefferson. For this great Baptist university, that of course is obviously wrong. The second distortion is the argument that this principle of separation was hijacked by later 19th and early 20th century anti-Catholic and anti-religious nativists who introduced all manner of prejudicial changes in American law in the name of separation of church and state, but to the detriment of religious freedom for all. Because of its recent paternity and because of its odious pedigree, we now see regularly argued, we should discard the principle of separation of church and state and some of those harsher laws that it occasioned, including old laws against state funding and state support for religious institutions. I respectfully disagree with this new history. My reading of the sources leads me to conclude that the principle of separation of church and state has a much longer history and a much more complex and wholesome pedigree than some recent historians would have us believe. This evening I'd like to argue that long before Jefferson penned his famous 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists, the 18th century American founders had at least 5 distinct understandings of the principle of separation of church and state, several of them with deep Western roots. Each of these understandings, I submit, made important contributions to the protection of religious liberty in the 19th century, and most of these understandings still hold enduring lessons for us today. Separation of church and state is by no means the only teaching of the First Amendment religion clauses, but it is an essential principle of religious liberty which we are trying now fervently to reject at our peril and at the peril of religious liberty. That's the thesis. This is an historical gathering. We do history. And so let's rummage together in a few piles of library dust and see what's going on in the founding period and the run-up to the same. Separation of church and state is often regarded as a distinctly American and relatively modern invention. In reality, separationism is an ancient Western teaching rooted ultimately in the Bible. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly commanded the chosen people of ancient Israel to remain separate from the Gentile world around them and to separate the Levites and other temple officials from the rest of the people. The Hebrew Bible also made much of building and rebuilding walls of separation to protect the city of Jerusalem from the outside world and to separate the temple and its priests from the commons and its people. The New Testament warned Christian believers to remain separate from the world and its temptations and ever mindful that their true citizenship lies in heaven. Echoing the Hebrew Bible, St. Paul spoke literally in Ephesians 2:14 about a wall of partition, a wall of separation between Christians and non-Christians interposed by the law of God. These biblical passages have inspired a long history of Western reflection on separation and the wall of separation between church and state. The archives hold a massive farrago of patristic and medieval and early modern sermons and biblical commentaries that call for all manner of separations between the faithful and the fallen, the religious and the political, the clergy and the laity, the spiritual and the temporal, the church and the state. At the same time, churchmen and statesmen over the centuries forged countless treaties, statutes, and constitutional provisions to define and delimit their respective offices and powers and to determine their mutual rights and duties vis-a-vis the other. These theological and political teachings of the Western tradition were distilled into powerful dualistic models of separationism, captured in such phrases as two ways, two cities, two powers, two swords, two kingdoms, and other such constructions. Many of these models were transmitted across the Atlantic to the American colonies and the young American states, and then transmuted to accommodate local colonial and new national conditions. The 18th century American founders called upon this deep and rich Western legacy to press at least 5 concerns at once in the name of separation of church and state. First, the founders invoked the principle of separation as a means to protect the church from the state. This had been a common Christian understanding of separation since the 1st century of the Common Era. It was captured in the Christian clergy's perennial call in subsequent centuries for freedom of the church, libertas ecclesiae, or what the Edict of Milan of 313 for the first time called the free exercise, or the free practice of religious groups. The 18th century American founders' principal concern, drawing on this legacy, was to protect church affairs from state intrusion, church properties from state encroachment, church rules and rituals from political coercion or control. This understanding of separation of church and state was prominent in 18th century America. The great New England Puritan jurist Elisha Williams spoke for many churchmen in his day when he wrote in 1744, "Every church has the right to judge in what manner God is to be worshipped by them, and what form of discipline ought to be observed by them, and what clergy ought to be elected by them, from all of which the state must be utterly and completely separate." George Washington wrote in 1785 of the need, quote, "to establish effectual barriers so that there is no threat to the religious rights of any religious society, including particularly beleaguered minorities like Jews and Catholics and Quakers, whom Washington favored with a number of touching and tender letters." This first understanding of separation of church and state was captured especially in state constitutional guarantees from 1776 forward of the free exercise rights of religious bodies. Those bodies' ability to incorporate and to hold property, to appoint and remove clergy, to have sites and rights of worship, education, charity, mission, and burial, to maintain standards of entrance and exit for their members and their leaders, and more, all of which were specified in some detail in state constitutions and enabling statutes. This understanding of separationism was also implicit in the First Amendment free exercise guarantee: Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Earlier drafts of this First Amendment provision and the cryptic 1789 House debates that survive about these drafts spoke repeatedly of the need to protect religious sects, denominations, groups, or societies, to guarantee their rights to worship, property, and practice. And none of this concern for the more detailed rights of religious groups was rejected in the House debates or the ratification debates that followed, and can at least be plausibly read into the blunt little provision, the nub we get left: Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. Second, the 18th century founders invoked the principle of separation to protect not only the church from the state, but also the state from the church. This was a more recent Western understanding, but it came to be increasingly prominent in the 17th and the 18th centuries. The sorest tyrannies have been those who have united the royalty and the priesthood in one person or office, wrote the authors of Cato's Letters in 1723. Churchmen, when they ruled states, had not only double authority, but also double insolence and remarkably less mercy and regard to conscience, property, and the domains and demands of statecraft. In the same vein, John Adams devoted a good deal of his 1774 dissertation on the canon and the feudal law to documenting what he called the tyrannous outrages that the medieval Catholic Church and various early modern Protestant churches had inflicted through their control of the state. This was, said Adams, a wicked confederacy between two systems of tyranny. This second understanding of separation of church and state helped to inform the movement in some states to exclude ministers and other religious officials from participating in or running for political office. Such exclusions had been commonplace amongst 17th century American Baptists and Puritans, but they became ever more commonplace in 18th century America. 7 of the original 13 states and 15 later states banned ministers of the gospel from serving in any political office. State constitutional provisions that were not formally outlawed until the 1978 U.S. Supreme Court case of McDaniel versus Patty. Third, the founders invoked the principle of separation of church and state also as a means to protect the individual's liberty of conscience from the intrusions and collusions of both church and state together. This had been an early and enduring understanding of separationism amongst Quakers and Baptists in the colonial and early Republican period. Then this argument became ever more prominent in the course of the 18th century. Every man has an equal right to follow the dictates of his own conscience in the affairs of religion. The great Baptist preacher Isaac Backus put it in 1774. And this is an equal right with any rulers, be they civil, be they ecclesiastical, or much worse, be they civil and ecclesiastical together. James Madison put this case in his 1785 memorial and remonstrance, calling for what he termed a great barrier between church and state to defend the religious rights of the individual in the solitude and sanctuary of their consciences. Thomas Jefferson's famous 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association also tied the principle of separation of church and state directly to the principle of liberty of conscience. After his opening salutation, Jefferson's letter reads as follows, and please bear with a bit of a long quotation, because this is the sine qua non letter of separation logic. Here's the letter. Believing with you Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between a man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, comma, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation, on behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of these sentiments, which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. End of quote. In Jefferson's famous formulation here, separation of church and state assured individuals of their natural rights of conscience, which could be exercised freely and fully to the point of breaching or shirking their social duties. Jefferson is not talking here about separating politics and religion altogether. Indeed, in the very next paragraph of his letter, President Jefferson performed an avowedly religious act of offering prayers on behalf of his Baptist correspondents. He wrote, I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and the blessing of the common Father and Creator of man. Fourth, the principle of separation of church and state was occasionally used as well to argue for the protection of individual states from interference by the federal government in their governing of local religious affairs. The separation that the founders had in mind here was between local church-state relations and the federal government. The federal government could not interfere in the affairs of local churches, and the federal government could not interfere in the affairs of local states in their interactions with those local churches. This is a principle of federalism. And under this federalist jurisdictional reading of separationism, state governments were free to patronize and protect religion or to prohibit or abridge religion as their own state constitutions dictated or allowed. But the federal government was entirely foreclosed from the same, and the federal courts had no jurisdiction to interfere with those local arrangements. Some scholars and judges have imputed this fourth understanding of separation of church and state into the First Amendment provision that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The argument is that Congress shall make no laws respecting a state establishment of religion. After all, in 1789, when the First Amendment was being drafted, 7 states and the counties of New York City still had some forms of religious establishment, which both their state legislatures and their state constitutional conventions had just defined and defended, often against strong opposition by religious nonconformists or dissenters. Moreover, Virginia had just passed Jefferson's bill for the, quote, establishment of religious freedom, against firm opposition now from the Anglican establishment. Having just defended their state establishments of whatever sort at home from 1776 to 1789, the new members of Congress who were drafting the First Amendment religion clauses were not about to relinquish control of them to the new federal government, the most dangerous branch, the Congress. This is a plausible reading of the respecting language in the First Amendment, though the evidence for or against it in the surviving House and ratification debates is demonstrably razor thin. But this Federalist reading of the Establishment Clause is becoming more prominent today, especially amongst originalists on the federal bench. And it's been given especially powerful expression by Justice Thomas in 5 sets of different opinions. It's part and product of the United States Supreme Court's neo-federalist revolution on many areas of constitutional law over the past couple of decades, most notably its narrowing interpretation of the Commerce Clause of Article 1 and its narrowing interpretation of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which you con law wonks in the audience know all about. And I won't bore you further. Fifth and finally, the principle of separation of church and state was also adduced as a means to protect society and its members from unwelcome participation in and support for religion. Already in later colonial America, several religious groups, Baptists most prominently, used the separation of church and state principle in this way to argue against the established church's policies of mandatory payments of tithes, or required participation in oath swearing, or forced attendance at religious services, or compulsory registration of their church properties, and much more. At the turn of the 19th century, the language of separation of church and state also began to fuel broader campaigns to remove traditional forms and forums of religion in law, politics, and society altogether, and to end long-standing practices of giving special state protection, patronage, privilege, and participation in religion. This was the most novel and the most controversial understanding of separation of church and state in the young American Republic, but it began to gain ample rhetorical currency in the course of the 19th century, especially as that rhetoric was likewise peaking in post-revolutionary France. The first and most notorious instance came in 1800, during the heated election debates between Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party and John Adams's Federalist Party. This was a clash of propaganda machines that make modern presidential elections look like child's play. Adams' party accused Jefferson of being the Antichrist, the whore of Babylon, a Jacobin infidel and secularist bent on destruction of the necessary religious foundations of law and the necessary alliances of church and state. Jefferson's party accused Adams of being a Puritan pope, a religious tyrant, bent on subjecting the whole nation to his suffocatingly narrow beliefs and to his smug, self-serving black-robed ministers who stood foursquare against liberty and progress. These proved to be only the opening shots in a century-long American battle over the meaning and the means of separating church and state. The battles broke out thereafter with equal rhetorical violence and excess over issues like dueling, Freemasonry, lotteries, drunkenness, Sunday laws, slavery, marriage, divorce, women's property and voting rights, religious education, blasphemy prosecutions, and umpteen further things. These were battles fought in Congress and in the courts, in states and on the frontier, in churches and in the schools, in clubs and at the ballot box. They were largely wars of words, occasionally and tragically wars of arms. The battles included many familiar foes, Republicans and Federalists, the North and the South, nativists and new immigrants. They also featured a whole set of exotic new political groups and parties: the Know Nothing Party, the American Protective Association, the National Liberal League, the American Secular Union, the Ku Klux Klan, and literally hundreds of other such groups that sprung up like Topsy. Let me just focus on one running episode in this great 19th century battle, namely the repeated clashes between Protestants and Catholics in America over separation of church and state. The long and the sad story of the anti-Catholicism of 19th century American Protestants is well known. Around 1800 or so, American Protestants and Catholics had seemed ready to put their bitter and bloody battles behind them. But with the swelling tide of Catholic emigres into America after the 1820s, all demanding work, building schools, establishing charities, converting souls, and gaining influence, native-born Protestants and patriots began to protest. Catholic bashing became a favorite sport of preachers and pamphleteers and politicians. Then rioting and church burnings broke out in the 1830s and 1840s, followed by even more vicious verbal pillorying and repressive actions against Catholics and their properties. What several recent studies have made clear is that the principle of separation of church and state became one of the strong new rhetorical weapons in the anti-Catholic arsenal. Foreign Catholics, the argument went, were for the union of church and state. American Protestants were for the separation of church and state. To be a Catholic was to oppose separationism and American-style liberties. To be a Protestant was to defend separationism and American-style liberties. To bash a Catholic was thus not a manifestation of religious bigotry, but a demonstration of American patriotism. Protestants and patriots began to run closely together, often tripping over each other to defend separationism and to decry and deny Catholics for their failure so to do. All this is a corrective, and a proper corrective, to the 19th century story that students of American history and religious liberty need to hear. But it's important that the corrected story not now be read as a simple dialectic of Protestant separationist hawks versus Catholic unionist doves, as several recent books and articles and even major court opinions has done. And it's important to be clear that the Protestant-Catholic battle over separation of church and state had two sides, with Catholics giving as well as taking, winning as well as losing. Three caveats to the correcting story. First, it must be remembered that prior to the 1860s, most American Catholic clergy were themselves separationists, building their views in part on ancient patristic and medieval models of separation: two powers, two cities, two swords, two ways. These American Catholic clergy saw separation of church and state as an essential principle of religious liberty for them as minorities. And they embraced that doctrine and principle, and indeed advocated it strongly without any concern or cavil. Second, many Protestant anti-Catholic writings that did emerge started not so much as gratuitous attacks upon American Catholics as counterattacks to several blistering papal condemnations of Protestantism, democracy, religious liberty, and separation of church and state. The papacy, charred by the savagery of the French Revolution, had a very different view of separation of church and state than did many American Catholics. In the 1832 papal document Mirari Vos, for example, Pope Gregory XVI condemned in no uncertain terms all churches that deviated from the Catholic Church and all states that granted liberty of conscience and free exercise and speech rights to non-Catholic citizens. For the Pope in this document was, quote, an absurd and erroneous proposition to claim that liberty of conscience must be maintained by everyone. Only Catholics deserve this privilege. The Pope, quote, denounced freedom to publish any writings whatsoever and disseminate them to the people. The Church has always taken action to destroy the plague of bad books with the cooperation of the state. The Pope declared anathema against, quote, the detestable insolence and probity of Luther and other Protestant sons of the devil, those sores and disgraces of the human race who joyfully deem themselves free of all. Even worse, the Pope declared in this same 1832 document, were the plans, quote, of those who desire to separate the church from the state and to break the mutual concord between temporal authority and the priesthood. The reality, the Pope insisted, was that state officials receive their authority not only for the government of the world, but especially for the defense of the true Catholic Church. In the blistering syllabus of errors, 30-odd years later, in 1864, the papacy condemned as cardinal errors the proposition, quote, that Protestantism is just another form of the same true Christian religion in which it is equally pleasing to dwell as to dwell in the Catholic Church. It is likewise, quote, a cardinal error that the Church ought to be separate from the state and the state from the Church. 6 years later, the Vatican Council declared the Pope's teachings to be infallible and condemned anew Protestants as, quote, heretics who dared subordinate the divine magisterium of the Church to the conscientious judgment of each individual. There are dozens of such documents that emerge in the 1830 to 1870 period. They were frontline, headline news all over the capitals of media in the United States and well beyond. It's perhaps no surprise that American Protestants repaid such alarming comments in kind, and then with compounding interest. The Pope, as Americans heard him, had condemned the very existence of Protestantism and the very fundamentals of American democracy and liberty. Many Protestants saw in the papacy's favorable references to its past medieval powers specters of the Church's tyrannical rule and a unified Christendom. This simply could not be for American Protestants. Conveniently armed with new English translations of the writings of Martin Luther and John Calvin and a number of others, American Protestants repeated much of the vitriolic anti-Catholic and anti-clerical rhetoric that had clattered so loudly throughout the 16th century Protestant Reformation. At least initially, the loud commendation of America's separation of church and state and loud condemnation of the Catholics' union of church and state was aimed as a rhetorical quid pro quo rather than a political low blow to American Catholics. But inevitably, there was plenty of political imitation and plenty of cheap shots taken as the Catholic American clergy began to stand up to defend and echo the papacy. And inevitably, this rhetoric brought anti-Catholicism and pro-separationism into close association in the minds of the propagandists, especially on the far right and the far left. And a third and brief final caveat to this story is that when local anti-Catholic measures did pass, and they did with alarming alacrity in the 19th and early 20th century, the United States Supreme Court sometimes provided Catholics with relief in the name of separation of church and state. So, in 1866, in the case of Cummings versus Missouri, the court held that a state may not deprive a Catholic priest of the right to preach for failure to take a mandatory oath disavowing his support for the Confederate States. The ground for the decision: liberty of conscience and separation of church and state, and the link between them. In Watson versus Jones of 1871 and 6 subsequent cases over the next 50 years, the court required civil tribunals to defer to the judgment of the highest religious authorities in resolving intra-church disputes over property. extending explicitly that principle to Catholics, again on the strength of separation of church and state. And in Pierce versus Society of Sisters in 1925, the court invalidated a state law making public school attendance mandatory, thereby protecting the right of Catholic schools and Catholic parents and Catholic school children, again in expression of separation of church and state, separation of private religious schools and public schools. All of these holdings were expressions of the principle of separation of church and state for the protection of religious liberty of a beleaguered minority. And there are dozens additional cases in the lower federal courts and hundreds in the state courts. Give me 10 minutes and then we can talk. All this changed dramatically with the United States Supreme Court case of Everson v. Board of Education in 1947. This case made two major moves at once. First, it rendered the First Amendment Establishment Clause applicable not only to the federal government, Congress, but also to state and local governments. It incorporated it into the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause and made it a universal principle of religious freedom. But second, Justice Black, in the Everson case, read into the Establishment Clause a strict separationist logic that was amply coded and coded with the same anti-clerical, anti-Catholic, and sometimes anti-religious rhetoric that Black had absorbed as a member of the nativists, including being a ranking member of the Ku Klux Klan before he joined the court. Here's what Black wrote for the court in 1947. Neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church. Neither can pass laws which aid one religion, aid all religions, or prefer one religion over another. No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions, whatever you may call them. Neither a state nor the federal government can openly or secretly participate in the affairs of any religious organization or group, or vice versa. In the words of Thomas Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. End quote. The next year, Black continued in a case called McCullum v. Board of Education. Here's what he wrote for the majority. Religion is too powerful, too sinister, too greedy to permit its unhindered pervasion or perversion of the civil magistracy. The same powerful religious propagandists who are allowed to succeed in making one inroad on the state and its laws doubtless will continue their propaganda, looking toward complete domination and supremacy of their peculiar brand of religion. It's nearly always by insidious approaches that the citadels of liberty are most successfully attacked. The First Amendment has thus erected a wall of separation between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach. If you want more quotes, read the article that will eventually appear in Professor Thomas's edited anthology. The Supreme Court applied this strict separationist logic, especially in cases dealing with traditional state patronage of religious education. In more than 24 cases after Everson, the court purged religion from the public school and removed religious schools from most of their state support. No religious texts or ceremonies or symbols were welcome in public schools, and no direct or indirect support or participation by government was allowed in religious schools. And at Lemon v. Kurtzman, the Supreme Court distilled this into the famous three-part test that said any government policy challenged under the Establishment Clause must satisfy three criteria to pass constitutional muster. The policy must have a secular purpose, must have a primary effect that neither advances nor inhibits religion, and may not foster an entanglement that's excessive between church and state. And this Lemon test, as it came to be called, rendered the Establishment Clause a formidable obstacle to many traditional forms of state collaboration, cooperation with the churches and other religious groups. Some of these Establishment Clause cases, in the name of separation of church and state, helped to extend the ambit of religious liberty, particularly for minority faiths. But some of these cases also helped to erode the province of religious liberty by effectively giving a single secular party a heckler's veto, vetoing popular laws touching religion that caused him only the most tangential of constitutional injury. It must be remembered that separation of church and state is only one principle that the Establishment Clause teaches, and that the Establishment Clause is paired with the Free Exercise Clause in guaranteeing religious freedom. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, is what the First Amendment Religion Clause says. And these two religion clauses together hold complementary guarantees of religious freedom. The Free Exercise Clause outlaws government proscriptions, prohibitions of religion, actions by government that unduly burden the conscience, that restrict religious expression, that discriminate against religion, or invade by government the autonomy of churches and other religious bodies. The Establishment Clause, in turn, outlaws government prescriptions of religion, actions that coerce the conscience, that mandate forms of religious expression, that discriminate in favor of religion, or improperly ally the state with churches or other religious bodies. No undue burden on, no coercion of conscience, no undue restrictions on, no undue mandating of religious expression, no discrimination against, no discrimination for religion, no government intrusions within, no government alliances with religious bodies. Read together this way, the Free Exercise and Establishment Clauses afford reciprocal and complementary protections to the founding principles of religious freedom in the 18th century. Freedom of conscience, freedom of exercise, religious pluralism, religious equality, no establishments of religion, and yes, separation of church and state. When viewed in isolation, the principle of separation of church and state serves religious liberty best when it is used prudentially and not categorically. James Madison, a firm proponent of separationism in his later life especially, warned in 1833 already that, quote, "It may not be easy in every possible case to trace the line of separation between the rights of religion and the civil authority with such exactness as to avoid collisions and doubts on unessential points," unquote. Madison's caveat has become even more salient today. For better or for worse, the modern American welfare state, and now the modern American security state, reaches very deeply into virtually all aspects of modern life through its vast network of laws on education, charity, welfare, childcare, healthcare, construction, zoning, workplace, taxation, immigration, and sundry other topics. Madison's preferred solution was what he called, quote, "an entire abstinence of government from interference with religion in any way whatsoever, beyond the necessity of preserving public order and protecting each sect against trespasses on its rights by others." This traditional understanding of a minimal state role in the life of society in general and of religious bodies in particular, however alluring it might be in classical liberal or modern libertarian theory, is no longer realistic in practice. some level of confrontation and cooperation between church and state are almost inevitable in our modern polity for any form of faith that happens to peek out of its hermitic cave, and even that cave is subject to zoning law. It's thus even more imperative today than it had been in Madison's day that the principle of separation of church and state not be pressed to reach what Madison called the unessentials, the adiaphora. Government must strike a balance between coercion, equality, and freedom. The state cannot coerce citizens to participate in religious ceremonies and subsidies and programs that they find odious. But the state cannot prevent citizens from participation in public programs and forums just because they happen to be religious citizens. It is one thing to outlaw Christian prayers and broadcasted Bible readings from the public grade school. After all, students are young and impressionable and compelled to be there. It's quite another thing to ban moments of silence and private religious speech in these same public grade schools. It's one thing to bar direct tax support for the core of religious education. Quite another thing to bar tax deductions or credits for parents who choose to educate their children in religious schools. It's one thing to prevent government officials from delegating their core police powers to religious bodies. Quite another thing to prevent them from facilitating equally the charitable services of voluntary religious and non-religious groups alike. To press separationist logic too deeply into the unessentials not only trivializes religion, as Stephen Carter has effectively argued, it also trivializes the Constitution, converting it from a coda of cardinal principles of national law into a codex of petty precepts of local life. Individuals should exercise a comparable prudence in seeking protection from the public expressions of religion that they cannot abide. In the constitutional schemes of 19th century America, it was not so much the courts as the frontier that provided this freedom, a place away from it all, where one could escape with one's conscience and co-religionists. Today, the frontier still provides this freedom, if not physically in small towns and wild mountains out west, then virtually in our ability to sift out and shut out the public voices of religion that we do not wish to hear. Both modern technology and modern privacy doctrine make escape to this virtual frontier considerably easier than in the days of covered wagons and mule trains. Just turn off Pat Robertson and the televangelists. Turn away the missionary at your door. Close your eyes to the city crucifix that offends. Cover your ears to the public prayer that you can't abide. Forgo the military chaplain's pastoral counseling. Skip the legislative chaplain's prayers. Walk past the town hall's menorah and star. Don't join the religious student group in your public university. Don't vote for the religious candidate. Don't browse the evangelicals' newspapers. Avoid the services of the Catholic counselors. Shun the readings of the Scientologists. Turn down the trinkets of the coal porters. Turn your back on the ministries of the hate mongers. All these escapes to the virtual frontier, the law does and will protect with force if necessary. Such voluntary self-protections from religion will ultimately provide far greater religious freedom for all than pressing yet another tried and tired constitutional case in the name of separation of church and state. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Professor Thomas and the president told me this is the most brilliant class in the history of Mercer University. And those that have gathered here are amongst the most precocious. And so our job is to have a little conversation. You've listened very long and hard. There's wonderful things outside to tempt you, but you doubtless have a question or two or a comment or two. Why don't we get started? Mr. Elliott, of course, has priority in the queue. Any questions, any comments, any quips, grunts of life, indications of moderate interest? Nothing. Nothing. What do we got? Mr. President.
I'll start us off. Great lecture, by the way. Very appropriate here, by the way. Jesse Mercer, who our university is named after, was a Baptist minister who crafted the first religious freedom provision in our state constitution.
Yep.
So everybody's heard about the Hobby Lobby case, an important free exercise case decided this term. And since we have an eminent law professor here who's an expert in the religious freedom clauses,
yeah, so prophecy with this U.S. Supreme Court is a very dangerous game to be in. They have a predictable right wing and a predictable left wing and three gunners down the middle whose pathways are hard to predict. Everybody know what the Hobby Lobby case is? It's basically a question about whether a privately held for-profit corporation that is run by an evangelical Christian couple has to fully abide by the mandatory contraceptive order. That as a matter of federal law, they're required to carry insurance allowing a party to have the full range of contraceptive protections, including abortifacient protections that allow a fertilized egg to be removed by these techniques. And the Greens, while allowing a number of forms of contraception, draw the line and say of the 17 available kinds of contraception that must be covered, 4 of them we can't cover because they are post-implantation and we think that's abortion. And sorry, we can't do that in good conscience. And we can't pay for a policy of medical insurance for our employees that would have that as an option. We can't be party to this. We don't have to have insurance at all. We're making insurance available. We think it's an important part of our service to our employees. We have an ethos in our company that is Christian. We have the Sunday off. We observe the Christian holidays. We have a no drinking policy on our premises. We have a no drug policy on our premises. We have a no swearing policy on our premises. We are a sincere, good faith Christian organization that happens to run a craft store, a big set of craft stores for massive profit. And so the issue before the United States Supreme Court is an issue of whether this privately held for-profit corporation can claim a free exercise right to be excused from full compliance with the law. And it's not just free exercise nakedly, it's free exercise actually through a federal statute, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is in place for the last 20 years, that allows for claims to be made against government when government burdens somebody's rights of free exercise, or now statutorily captured free exercise rights. And so now we have the hearings, we have predictable questions, and we have the Three Mavericks. And the Mavericks are, in this view, Justice Kennedy always. He loves to be in the middle. The Chief Justice Roberts, and my old law professor, Stephen Breyer. And those are the 3 I can't predict. My suspicion is the court is going to say, we can deal with this issue narrowly. We can just talk about RFRA rights, Religious Freedom Restoration Act rights, which force the government to give a compelling state interest and follow the least restrictive alternative for achieving that interest. And if we use that standard here, we can narrowly say, I'm not sure you followed the least restrictive alternative. You've substantially burdened this party unnecessarily. They've gone pretty far to accommodate the mandate, but they have gone to the utter limits of conscience. And there seems to be a clear instance of this being truly conscience claims, not pretext. This is not just public interest, cool case litigation. This is a sincere claim. And the court could very well say, in this narrow context, privately held company, for-profit or not-for-profit, clearly can have a religious identity, which religious identity can be burdened, and which practice and identity together are protected by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. If the case goes for the Greens, for the Hobby Lobby, it's going to be narrow. But it's going to be narrow, and importantly narrow. There's a background to this question, which has not been mooted much in the reports, at least of the arguments, which the justices may be taking into account seriously, which is, let's back up a little bit. It's one thing to say, post Roe v. Wade, that the government may not intrude upon the rights of a woman to abort. Fine. It's another thing to say it's the government's obligation to pay for a woman's ability to exercise this right to abort. Okay. It's a third thing to say the government can foist that payment obligation now upon another private party who has a fundamental right objection to that right to abortion. And we're 2 steps away from Roe v. Wade. And we're 2 steps away from what is the core set of rights that are in conflict. The right to abortion is a right vis-a-vis the government. The right claim here is a much more attenuated 2-step away right that's being juxtaposed to a statutory free exercise right that has been called fundamental. And if that's part of the background conversation, I can see the Supreme Court saying, what is this? What is this? If Congress wants to pay for abortions, great. You can't hand that bill down the chain to another private party. And that conversation hasn't been part of the oral debates. It's not been briefed that much, but in my view is actually the more fundamental question. My prediction, 6-3 or 5-4 for Hobby Lobby. I will no doubt be wrong, but that's okay. Other questions? The great man himself, Professor Novak, this is one of the great historians and scholars of religious liberty and religion in American history. You're going to have the privilege of hearing him tomorrow night. He's one of the great scholars in the field in the world. Listen to him tomorrow. With that build-up, you better have a good question.
This argument. First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. But isn't it an important breach of that amendment when the President and the Congress choose to define what is religion?
Yeah.
It's one thing to do it in church, they say, but your schools, they don't count. Your charity work, they don't count.
Right.
I've never heard of a government telling religion what religion is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of the problem here, and that's what's a bit at issue. Is all of a sudden Congress, in this contraceptive mandate, the President and the attendant executive orders, or both together, aren't they in the business of defining the venues for religion? And that religion is something you do in your prayer closet, something you do in your conscience, something you do in your church, synagogue, or mosque, something you might do at the prayer rail, but not something that you take into common life. This public-private division, which is implicit in that division, is really troublesome. I'm an old-fashioned Calvinist. We were brought up that all of life is religion. All of life is a worship of God. All of life is love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what you're supposed to do. And everything that you do, your life is animated by your faith. You put an Orthodox Jew up here, he'll say exactly the same thing, from tying his shoes all the way through to reading the Torah. Life is religion. And the notion that religion is now located only in sanctuaries where worship occurs belies what has always been the case. Religion is involved in a lot of things institutionally. Not only do individuals have different ways they express their faith, but institutions gather around those expressions of faith. Charity and mission work and emergency relief, various kinds of activities that are obviously part of the paraministry of the church clearly fit within that, and we have laws that recognize that. Those might be in jeopardy if this case goes down the other way. And now the notion that you can say, no, when you are selling crafts, you can't be religious, but if you're selling Bibles, you are, for profit either way, That's nonsense. And it's a nonsensical distinction which troubles those that look at the text itself or that look at what religious liberty really is about. And international norms will never go to that extreme. We have in international jurisprudence, human rights jurisprudence, a lot of discussion about legal personality for religious groups. And who may enjoy legal personality, that is, make claims for rights? Well, it's anybody. It's done phenomenologically, functionally. Not the label on the door, not that's worship and therefore nothing else. It's done on the strength of what you do, and what motivates your doing, and what you call yourself. And to put those three things together, and then you have a much more sweeping ambit of what counts for religion. Please, sir.
Our last one, I'm afraid.
Only one more?
Only one more.
Good Lord. All right. You better be good, too.
I do my best. Thank you for your time, sir. And you said that this principle is best to be used prudentially, not categorically. So my question for you is, how do we reconcile that with the religious practices of those who may be a danger to themselves or others? And specifically, I'd like to ask you about the religious exemptions for vaccinations of communicable diseases.
Yeah, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. Good question. So there's a background notion of battery here that has to be taken into account. Every party has his own bubble or her own bubble, and that party is free to say, I don't want any more care. And a doctor or a health professional or another party that seeks to override that autonomous decision made by the individual adult who is viewed as rational at the time of that declaration, the action taken to intrude that bubble is a criminal case of battery. You cannot invade the body once that body has told you clearly, explicitly, rationally, no. And that's done by advance directives, by various kinds of declarations, done by surrogates, family members, and others. You can refuse care. An adult is free to refuse vaccinations as a matter of religious principle or as a matter of personal autonomy. An adult, rational person can make the calculation that side effects, not so sure, God is going to protect me or provide for my well-being, whatever the motivation. An adult is free, in general principle, to refuse vaccinations. Here are the two questions. Number one, can you refuse a vaccination if you're dealing with a case of emergency? When the failure of vaccination makes you an agent that inevitably is going to infect someone else. When you have a communicable disease that is communicated through normal interactions, take a virus that spreads quickly but can easily be offset by the vaccination. In that instance, the government's concern for the fundamental right of life and health and safety of another can override your personal privacy aversion and even your personal religious aversion to a vaccination. And the question is going to be, do we stick a needle in your arm or do we send you to Antarctica? And both of those choices are there. And government has emergency health, safety, and welfare power to override that choice. And in an unusual course, with lower probabilities of transmission by various kinds of communicable diseases, then the party can reflect. Somewhere along that line, there's a line that crosses and the state will say you have to. So that's one. And the second exception is that when you are speaking for somebody else, namely Junior, your kid, a baby, a little toddler, a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and that young child over whom you have responsibility, say as a parent or as a licensed guardian, whether you can, on behalf of that child, exercising that child's rights surrogately and exercising your parental rights directly, whether you can say, vis-a-vis that child, no, that child does not want to be vaccinated. I refuse to give my permission for that child to be vaccinated. And on this question, states differ. Some states say, tough. We are going to step into the shoes of the parent. We will be parents patriae. we will decide what ultimately is best for Junior. And failing to vaccinate Junior against an easily precludable disease, take polio or some of the other ones, and failing to vaccinate him against that and rendering that child vulnerable, that's a problem, say, a number of states. A few states back off and say, no, it's your parents' choice. And Junior, especially when a vaccination later in life might still provide sufficient relief. It's harder when you're talking about vaccinations that are going to either protect the child's natural development or expose that child to a risk that also is going to expose others to the risk of communicable disease. And I don't know enough in this, even in this medical school audience, to know what exactly those are, but there's a battery of those kind of viruses that we worry about. In those instances, the principle of the first exception applies to the second exception too. Principle of the first exception says health, safety, and welfare concerns can trump fundamental privacy and even religious privacy concerns. That same principle obtains here too, and says, no, there comes a point where we become the parent, overriding your parental decision, and Junior's going to get his needle. And that turns upon the factors of highly probable deformity or other ill effects by the failure of vaccination, and or the production of a condition in that child unvaccinated that is going to expose other kids to that same disease or same problem. And in those instances, almost uniformly, states will say, sorry, do the vaccination. And parents, I'm very sorry, you can go get an injunction, but meanwhile we'll give Junior his needle.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you tomorrow, but please join me in thanking you.
So if anybody wants to email me, I got some cards up here. Come on by.